University, and he's talking about the implications in a real sense of some of the things that are happening in reference to institutional racism and the impact that it is having upon African American youth as well as other youth in American society. But
Absolutely.
we are today specifying African American youth within that regard. Go on.
Yes, and on the last segment, we mentioned how if we had money up front rather than placing it into the prison systems, how we could indeed improve African American youth. I think an excellent case study is Dr. Kennedy in Harlem. Over 70 blocks of pure poverty, where he has a school system there where he's able to take those students, and every one of them, 100%, graduates, and then at a high percentage, 100%, go on to the universities and they graduate as well. But he has a very innovative educational system that helps them. It's holistic. He brings in the family members, the community, and everyone that's involved. He makes sure they have something to eat, just like someone in a rich area would have something to eat. He makes sure they have health care, just like someone in a rich family would have a health care. So he takes a holistic approach, and if we had that up front to help people in different communities around the United States, I think we should certainly see a vast improvement with African American youth, as well as other ethnic groups that are in the criminal justice system. I wanted to also, if I could, pick up on how we started off at the very outset, thinking in terms of this institutionalized racism and Dr. Gordon Allport and the nature of prejudice. When you think in terms of it, he has a 5 scale on acts of prejudice. One he calls antilocution. And that's when groups of people might get around and they might congregate and they might talk about certain things. And some people in there may not act out in a very negative way toward others, but they might listen and agree and support it. The second one is avoidance, when you might want to avoid issues related to problems that might be in existence within our society. Oh, they live over there, or they live in a poverty.
That's not a problem.
That's not a problem for us. That's not our problem. And then the next one is discrimination. When that same group of people in antilocution or avoidance start to say, well, let me then send my child over into this area, or let's move to another area so we can avoid being with that particular group, or let's send ours to the private school. Then the next one is physical attack, going back to the same type of act on a prejudice that Zimmerman did when he saw a person. He had a prejudice, a preconceived notion that was unwarranted about another individual, and then a physical attack that would occur. And that's the pure nature of it, and even in the subconscious. And the last level Dr. Gordon Allport talks about, as we've seen in America and across the country, is that of extermination. That's an extreme act on prejudice. But I think what he brings out so poignantly in his book, The Nature of Prejudice, is that all of them are very inclusive to the last one that's the worst. But the last one, you have members that belong to the antilocution. So when you're voting in a certain way, or you're siding a certain way on an issue that's avoiding someone who's in need and voting against those types of issues, you are acting on a type of prejudice.
That's part of what we mean when we talk about
institutional racism.
But you declare that you're not a racist yourself, because you know some people, and et cetera, and et cetera, and et cetera.
Yes.
But in terms of your subconscious in reference to how you deal with that, you are in reality part of what we call institutional racism.
Institutional
racism.
racism. It's there.
And you don't want to admit it, but it's there anyway.
Yes.
Is that what we're saying?
That's exactly what we're saying. Now, I want to try to move it to a higher level, because sometimes within, let's just say, since the topic is African American and African American youth and institutionalized racism, sometimes African Americans who have moved up, had certain types of economic success, might feel that they have a false sense of reality as to where they might be within the society in which we live in, and feel that everything has been rid as far as racism is concerned. And sometimes that group that is indeed acting out in a very prejudicial way will look for a person of color, African American in particular, or any other ethnic group, who might think in that very same way. And that person might avoid trying to think consciously about how racism still exists. And what I usually try to ask a person, if they think because they have become highly educated, highly successful, if they went down to Jasper, Texas, and if their 550 SLC Mercedes had a flat tire, and if that same person driving that truck saw them walking up dressed up in their Giorgio Armani suit, but they were African American or another person of color, would they have done a U-turn and picked them up and dragged them as they did that person that they did that to? You see, sometimes we feel that we get so far removed from that because we become medical doctors or lawyers. And that's why I really appreciated President Barack Obama when he spoke about, well, yes, I'm president, but we still have this systematic institutionalized racism that exists within our society today. And it hits youth, it hits the healthcare system, it hits the educational system, it hits the economic system. All of those institutions that make up our society has that racism part that's still very present in it.
And a lot of folks don't want to deal with that, nor do they want to believe that.
That's right.
Somehow there is no institutional racism, and that all you have to do is to pull yourself up by your bootstrap, which might work sometime,
That's
but
right.
if it's institutional, you might pull yourself up by bootstraps here, but they'll catch you over there somewhere.
That's
so
right.
what we're talking about here is that we want to eliminate.
Yes.
Even though we might not be able to eliminate it, but make people much more aware of it.
That's correct.
And they can react to it differently.
Yes.
Is that what we're saying here?
That's exactly what we're saying. And there's a book entitled Privilege, Power, and Difference. And in this particular book, the author, who's a sociologist, suggests very strongly that those in the dominant group, meaning European Americans, have to understand this institutionalized racism in order to rid it. You can't get rid of it unless we can see it for what it is. It has to be diagnosed, no different than if you went to a medical doctor and they said you have the symptoms of the flu and you have to do these things to try to improve. We have to see that. And that's one of the problems, according to Dr. Joyce Leary, that we have in America, because we have never recognized or looked back on those 244 years of enslavement and said that's a problem that we have to include within our educational system to discuss, so all ethnic groups, the majority group as well as other ethnic groups, can talk about it. We have to see it as a ill, and then we can rid it and try to improve on it.
Over the last 2 minutes,
Yes.
somebody might be watching this show this morning and might wonder, am I impacted by institutional racism? What are some of the things that you can say that they can make their own self-assessment in terms of their attitudes and reference over the last couple of minutes?
Yes.
What, one,
Yes.
two, three, that
Yes.
kind of thing?
Yeah, there are plenty of things. One, we're having an obesity problem within our country. And in many instances, you find disproportionate African Americans are in that particular category. Second, when you look at any type of chronic illnesses, you will find that African Americans are certainly fall within all of those chronic illnesses, from heart attacks to diabetes to hypertension to high blood pressure, all of those things. And we can be very high in socioeconomic status as well as in job and in education, but we still have the symptoms. Dr. Leary talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome, how we might have this unconscious type of way of thinking that we're okay, but these actions that people inflict upon us still impact us in that way. And then in many instances, while we might be in a situation where we might live a certain way, we might find that even our children, when they are out and trying to improve and to better themselves, they may be confronted with it. And so how do we go about explaining that to them when they are being bright, when they are working very hard and doing the best they can, and you still can see that the reason they did not get the first violin position, or they did not get the opportunity for the scholarship, or they were left out in some type of way, is because of this same institutionalized racism that still exists. And if we have a viewing audience that, because I know we've been talking about African Americans, but what we have said today really is very inclusive to all other ethnic groups, as well as we're dealing with here in Tennessee right now with gay brothers, lesbian sisters, and being able to get married. You're going to find the same nature of prejudice that exists among any other group that is kind of looked at as the out group.
And it's part of the immigration problem and all those problems that are associated with that. All of that has a degree of institutional racism involved, and those individuals who get caught up in it ought to become much more aware of it. And I believe that there are a large number of folks who often get caught up in it, and if they knew more about it through information and education, I think, as you've indicated before, then their attitude could possibly change and might change.
That's right.
Because unless you know, then there's nothing that you can fight against. But once you know and you can hold yourself to a task in reference to this. And Dr. Stanford, let me thank you for bringing that excellent information by to us today. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.